Thanks so much, Alina, as always, for organizing things so expertly, and welcome to everyone here to Santa Barbara virtually. And this is Art Matters, and this indeed is the final lecture of our season. I'll be coming up with more speakers very shortly, and they'll be posted soon. So I hope you'll check back frequently to see when our program resumes. But I'm delighted to welcome today Tiffany Bell. And she's someone who's sort of legendary in the field because she's sort of the queen of the catalogue raisonné, which is a very particular type of project and about which I think she's going to be speaking at length in terms of the work of Agnes Martin. But it turns out that she's worked on pretty much the lineage of modernism of the last century and of the present in terms of the blue chip artists whom she has specialized in, including Dan Flavin. Currently, she's now in charge of the catalogue raisonné for Bryce Martin, but she's written copiously, and I'm sure many of you have read her things and recognize her name. But the other thing that's sort of nice for us is that she happens to be, and I'm sure she doesn't mention this frequently, but in Santa Barbara, it's meaningful. She happens to be related to our founder, Wright Luddington. So maybe she'll tell us a little bit about that too. I thought that was one of the happiest coincidences when I discovered that. But that's not really the reason that I asked her to join us. Agnes Martin is really one of those artists who continues to be sort of a fascination for all of us. And our speaker was in fact the organizing curator for a major retrospective that took place several years ago and traveled from the Tate to LACMA to the Guggenheim, so a major show. So there's nobody better qualified than she to address this topic. So with that, please join me in welcoming her to the virtual platform. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ike. Can you hear me? And Santa Barbara Museum has a special place in my heart, of course, because of my family connection there. So I'm very happy to be with all of you and to present this tonight. So now I'm going to try to share my screen and hope that this works. Okay, so I'm going to start. This is a portrait of Agnes Martin from 1992, a picture of her in her studio by Charles Rustin. It's basically the official portrait for Agnes Martin. So I began seriously working on the Agnes Martin catalogue raisonné in 2010 after a bit of preliminary research to get a sense of the scope of the project. It took about 10 years to complete both sections of the catalogue. The volume, including her paintings, was published in 2017, and the works on paper took a little longer and was published in 2019. When I started the project, I thought I knew something about Agnes Martin and art, but as I got into the research, I found that my understanding was uninformed. I knew her paintings from the 1980s and 90s best, and I knew that she lived in New Mexico. I basically thought of her work as related to minimalism and a retreat to New Mexico from New York as a good lifestyle choice. I had a lot to learn. Not long after I started the project, I reached out to the Lenore Tawney Foundation, hoping they had correspondence between Agnes Martin and Tawney, an artist who worked in weavings and was a close friend of Martin's in the late 1950s and 60s. While the foundation does have a few interesting pieces of correspondence, they also showed me this small painting they had uncovered in Tawney's closet after the artist's death. It's called Homage to Greece from 1959. It was a bit of a revelation to me, the rawness of the image, the cut canvas, the nails sticking out that form an arc across the top, because it seemed so different than the refined, exacting stripe paintings I was familiar with. It gave me an introduction to Martin's early work, which I now know was an important foundation to her later development. And from an article by Ann Wilson, another artist friend, I learned that this painting was Martin's first use of the grid. She described her first grid painting like this. This is Martin describing it. I cut up squares of canvas and pasted them on a small rectangular canvas. They are not exact squares. These were painted white, then I nailed down nails in a slight arch line near the top. I called it Homage to Ancient Greece, just the edge of an arch across the top. As you can see, it's this painting. The reverse of the painting was helpful too, because it is signed and titled. The title is a little bit different than what she describes in her written text, but it's close enough. And given the description, we knew this was the painting. And what's important about this then is it marks a milestone in Martin's oeuvre. It's her first move towards the use of the grid, a format that would become so important to the artist's work a couple of years later. The foundation, the Tawney Foundation, also had a portrait or a picture here that shows Tawney in her studio with the Agnes Martin painting on the wall on the right here. This painting, this work here is also by Agnes Martin. It's a construction from around 1958. So back to the catalogue raisonné. I should explain that it is a digital publication put out by Artifacts Press, and I'm going to show you a short video that shows how the catalog works. As many of you probably know, the task for the catalogue raisonné is to document every existing painting, construction, and unique work on paper that the artist made, providing the object description, that is the title, date, medium, dimensions, and any inscriptions by the artist on the object, as well as each work's history, the exhibitions it's been in, publications it's been reproduced in, and the provenance of each work. So as you can see here, the catalog is scrolling through chronologically the paintings that Agnes Martin made. And there is, for each picture of the painting, there is an entry, of course. And you can organize the catalog in various ways. It can go chronologically, beginning to end, and then you can see the later work and go backwards as well. So I'm showing you that here. So you get a sense of the beginning and the end of Agnes Martin's career. She died in 2004. So this started 2004 and it's going backwards through her career. And then it's going to go on to an entry. So each painting has an entry and it shows the descriptive information there on the right. And then there's provenance information, exhibition history, publication history. This particular painting has quite a lot written about it. Editor's comments and related artworks. It also has a number of photographs. With a digital catalog raisonné, you can put several images in. We've included two, one with a frame, so you can see the edges. This is on her studio wall, 1961, at the Betty Parsons Gallery in 1961, and at the Tate Modern in 2016. It also has a zoom feature, so you can click on the image and then you can actually go right in, zoom right in and see the detail. In this case, pencil line directly on the canvas, and then the dots along the left edge there are the ruler guides. And then going back to the entry, it has many links within it. So clicking on the link to the retrospective exhibition that traveled to 4 different venues, you can see this page, which shows all the works that were in the exhibition at the 4 different venues. So this is the range of her work, not chronologically, but you can see a range of what she did. And there's a lot more in the catalog, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what it looks like. Oh, now let's see if I can get to the next. Okay. So getting back to what the research uncovered, here again is the index page or the table of context for the catalog. It provides information, basically giving you the scope of her existing oeuvre. So it spans 7 decades. There are 1,115 works, which includes 639 paintings 8 constructions, 1 film, and 467 works on paper. You can see under the size that most of her paintings are square, and the works on paper generally fit into various themes or motifs. But you have to delve further into the catalog to understand other characteristics of Martin's oeuvre, of course. And most obviously are the gaps in her production. The biggest gap came between 1967 and 1974, so I tried to highlight that there. After a successful decade in New York City, during which she had several exhibitions and earned growing critical attention, Martin abandoned art making in 1967 to travel and eventually settle in New Mexico, where she would live the rest of her life. She only began painting again a few years later. Her first extant paintings are dated 1974, and she continued until her death in 2004. So her career naturally falls into 2 phases, one pre-1967 and the other post-1974. And the work, relatively speaking, does look different in the 2 phases. The early work included a developmental period, starting with student work, continuing through her experimentation with different approaches to abstraction, and culminating in her signature drawn grids on large white square canvases. In her later work, she presented series of related canvases that depend on the nuances of difference observed through and enhanced by repetition. Perhaps you get a sense of that in this slide, but I'll show you more. Beyond the division into 2 periods, there are gaps and breaks within each phase as well. In the first, which spans about 25 years, Martin destroyed large portions of her oeuvre. Though she has stated that she decided to become an artist around 1942 when she was at Columbia Teachers College, the earliest works I came across date to around 1947 when she was a student and then a teacher at the University of New Mexico. So on the left is a watercolor done in Taos, New Mexico, and on the right is a self-portrait that's in encaustic on canvas. And we think they're both from around 1947. It wasn't until a few years later, after coming into contact with some of the prominent American abstract expressionist artists, that she really began to evolve as a painter. She was about 10 years behind them when she started making paintings that resembled the biomorphic phase of abstract expressionism, using vaguely primordial-like forms. But even then, she was discarding much of her work. In a letter outlining what she had accomplished with a grant she had received in 1955, she stated that she had painted, quote, 100 canvases of which I had a good opinion and sold 7. Most of those that were not sold were presumably destroyed, and there are stories of large bonfires. So the existing works from that period are those few that sold and a few others that were obtained by friends and fellow students. Untitled 1955, which I'm showing you here, is certainly one of those 7. We know this because of a letter in the archives of the Institute of Arts at the University of Pennsylvania, written by Aileen Porter, who was an artist herself and wife to the well-known American landscape photographer, Elliot Porter. She writes, as an owner of the painting, to Suzanne Delahanty, the curator of the first retrospective exhibition of Martin's work that took place in 1973, saying that she had purchased the painting around 1955 and that it was new at the time. To identify the painting, she includes this drawing, which makes it possible to match her account to this painting, which is now owned by a prominent American collector. So this painting is related to other existing works from the period, but there are, however, a few anomalies from the same approximate period. And I'm showing you here a painting called The Expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. It's not dated, but it's likely from 1953. It's the only large-scale figurative oil painting that exists in Martin's extant work. It seems to show awareness of European surrealism, perhaps even Picasso, but also Native American art, because she was living in New Mexico at the time. Midwinter is also not dated, but most likely from 1954. In contrast to the figurative work, it seems to have more in common with the American landscape painting of the early 20th century by artists such as Arthur Dove, Marsden Hartley, and Georgia O'Keeffe. So the idea here is that even though there aren't so many paintings from this period of her work that are still extant, even from the few that do exist, we can see that she was really experimenting and very knowledgeable about European painting and American painting. Besides the gaps in production caused by the artist editing, there are others probably caused by episodes of mental illness. Martin wrote of having had trances since she was a teenager, knowingly describing a catatonic state. But the first recorded episode of her mental illness, which some have called schizophrenia, dates to 1962, when she was hospitalized for several months. For 1962, there are no large-scale oil paintings still existing. This seems surprising given that she made several large paintings in 1961, and then a predominance of large related oils in 1963. It's possible that she discarded some large paintings made in 1962. She does write to Suzanne Delahanty in another letter that she destroyed paintings from this year. But it also seems likely that she didn't paint while she recovered from her illness. I should add here, though, that there are a number of smaller paintings and quite a number of drawings from 1962. In the post-1974 phase of her art, she continued to edit her work. It really became part of her working strategy by this time. And she sometimes made several very similar canvases, discarding the ones that did not meet her exacting standards, and even is rumored to have destroyed whole bodies of work she deemed inadmissible. There are gaps in her production of paintings in these years too. Sometimes they have to do with other projects she was working on. In 1976, for example, she didn't make any paintings because she was working on a film called Gabriel. And in 1978, she only made watercolors when she was working on a second film, but that film was never finished. There are also no paintings from 1986, and this is probably due to illness again. But then in 1992, when she was 80 years old, she decided to stop painting again after making these two colored works, Untitled #1 and Untitled #2. At the time, she considered these her last paintings, but after moving into a retirement home in Taos, New Mexico, after only 6 months this time, she got herself a studio and started painting again. She reduced the size of her paintings from 6 to 5 feet square to make them easier to handle. At 80, she was still working without assistance, moving the large canvases around in her studio by herself. Besides seeing less productive years, listing all the works together makes it possible to recognize the more prolific years as well. 1989, for example, when Agnes Martin was 77 years old, seems to have been an especially creative year for her. In this year, she made 2 contrasting series, one white and one black. And this is a screenshot from the catalog that shows you examples from each series. They're of course not white and they're not black. They're both gray, but one is, we call them white and black. Makes it easier. And the last 12 years of her life proved very productive. Those 2 large paintings from 1992 that she had thought at the time would be her final works instead led to several series of quite colorful paintings, such as this group from 1995, which was another particularly fruitful year. I'm showing you here 8 paintings from a group of 19 from that year. So besides making the volume of Martin's work known, the research on the catalog raisonné has contributed to an understanding of the chronology of her work. The lack of records and the gaps in production made it difficult for scholars and others to date some of Martin's paintings, particularly the early ones. Agnes Martin did not always put dates on her early paintings, nor did she care too much about that aspect of her work. So this painting, for example, is called Harbor Number 1, and it's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it came into the collection dated circa 1959-60. However, an inventory list in the Betty Parsons archive, as well as a price list from a 1958 exhibition, indicate an earlier date of 1957 for this painting. And 1957 is another milestone year as it marks the beginning of the decade she spent in New York City, the years in which she honed her style and launched her career. This painting then is an early one in a rapid transition to greater simplicity in format and greater abstraction that led to her grid paintings of 1961, such as this one that was highlighted in the video I showed you. It's called The Islands, and it's 6 feet square. As the chronological ordering became clear, it became possible to recover the sense of some of the stylistic changes in her work that were largely obscured over time. The example that stands out to me is the radical shift she made in 1963, when she went from making paintings like Falling Blue, showing on the left, a royal blue color, and Friendship on the right, a work made of gold leaf and all that implies, to paintings such as Leaf in the Wind, probably the first of her paintings that were made so simply of pencil on white surfaces. When you sequence this group of really gorgeous paintings, the most richly and boldly colored of her existing oeuvre, next to the white or gray paintings with penciled grids from 1963 to 67, it becomes clear what Agnes Martin meant when she spoke of humility and humbleness as a theme in these paintings made from the most basic rudimentary materials. So I'm going to show, this is Leaf in the Wind. It's a painting that's in the Norton Simon Museum. I'm going to show you a detail so you get a better sense of it, of the pencil that's just drawn directly into the paint. And another painting from 1964, another one of the penciled grids. This is the leaf, called The Tree. It's in the Museum of Modern Art. And this is a detail that shows a closer observation of the many lines that actually make up the gradation of shadow and surface. So I guess it's obvious that repetition and consistency in format were important compositional strategies for Martin. Not only do her paintings have the same size, color, and material, after a certain point, she often used the same titles several times. Oh, sorry about that. Not only do her paintings have the same color, size, and material after a certain point, she often used the same title several times as well. For example, there are 3 paintings called Rose, the Rose, or just to add to the confusion, another called White Rose. So I'm showing details of the 3 Rose paintings because if you no doubt realize it's very difficult to reproduce Agnes Martin's paintings photographically. You can't always get the detail. So to show you the difference between these 3 paintings, I show you close-ups here. For art historians unaware of the different paintings with the same titles, these repetitions present certain difficulties. Though you can see a difference here in checklets that have no pictures, and even in pictures in the magazines or catalog in which a detail is not apparent. It's very hard to distinguish these paintings. To record their histories for the catalogue raisonné, there was quite a lot to untangle. But at least the 3 roses have different dates, having been done in 1964, 65, and 66. In the case of Leaf, there are 2 paintings of that title, both done in 1965. I'm showing the details of the paintings in the back section of each that shows Martin's inscriptions. These paintings are almost identical in appearance, at least as represented in photographs. The drawn grid, as you can see, is very similar in both. But in this case, the difference is that one painting is made using oil paint and the other is made with acrylic paint. And we know this from the inscriptions on the back, which I'm showing you there. So it seems likely that these two paintings represent an experiment in the use of different materials, the making of the same or similar painting in oil and acrylic paint as a test to see if acrylic paint, a relatively new medium on the market at the time, could render the image as she envisioned it. It seems she was satisfied with the look of the acrylic painting because she worked almost exclusively with acrylic after 1965. She also learned how to spell it with one L. In the pre-1967 work, the repetitious titles might indicate an attempt by the artist to convey the same content, or to use her term, the same inspiration in each painting. In the case of The Rose, for example, the title was a metaphor for the idea or memory of beauty for Martin. Arnie Glimcher, a founder of Pace Gallery and Martin's longtime dealer, tells a story about Agnes Martin and his young granddaughter. Martin showed the girl a rose and asked her if she thought the flower was beautiful. Once the child said yes, she then put the flower behind her back and asked again if the flower was beautiful. When the child said yes again, Martin explained that beauty was an abstract concept of the mind rather than an actual fact. So perhaps the three rose paintings, similar but not directly related, are independent approaches to a similar concept. After 1974, repetition, or rather variations of an obviously similar format, became an unmistakable strategy that takes on new meaning in Martin's work. By 1974, Martin had settled on a consistent format, which she continued to use until the end of her career. Her paintings are all square, of three sizes, mostly 72 by 72 inches, or later 60 by 60 inches, with a few small ones that are 12 by 12 inches. They are mostly made of stripes, painted with acrylic paint, or sometimes washes of ink, using a simple palette of red, blue, yellow, and black. Often, too, the stripes are outlined or simply drawn with graphite lines. Until well into the 1990s, she made paintings in groups, each a series of related paintings that are usually numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Some have described the post-1974 work as a long exhale after the considerable effort lasting more than 20 years that resulted in Martin's most radical work, the pencil grids from the mid-60s. In some sense, this is true. Much of the late work is a refinement of various characteristics found in her earlier work, but there is a difference too. Martin herself described the difference in terms of content. She said her early work is about joy, and the later work is about happiness. It's a little difficult to explain what she meant by this, but I think you can sense it in the work. It might help to understand what Martin meant by joy and happiness. They are similar. She wrote about it quite a lot. So anyway, in her terms, they are similar, but she associated joy with perception and awareness of reality. She associated happiness with life itself, or perhaps an awareness of life proclaiming, quote, "Happiness is our real condition. It is reality, it is life. Happiness is pervasive, it is everywhere and everywhere the same, and it is forever," unquote. So perhaps one could suggest in her works about joy, she was going for something awesome, sublime, and unique. But to convey happiness, her content is more common, about the continuities along with the infinite possibilities in the everyday world we live in. So now I'm going to tell you about the slide that I've been showing you. It's a group of works, prints, a series of 30 silkscreen prints that she made in 1973. So this was the first project she worked on after she started making art again, after she had quit in 1967. And I show you this group because they suggest the changes that were to come in her later work. According to the printer Kathleen Brown, who worked with Martin, the artist wanted to, quote, straighten out her lines and chose to make silk screens rather than etchings so as to get sharper lines. The resulting prints have clear, well-defined lines in comparison to the hand-drawn marks in her earlier drawings, or even the graphite lines in her paintings. In addition, the prints are a series. A group of 30 each depicts a different proportion grid or group of parallel lines. Seen together, they provide a template of possibilities. Though both sharp delineation of line and seriality could obviously have evolved from her early work, they are characteristics that parallel developments happening at the time in the work of a younger generation of artists who had already embraced Martin's art. Artists such as Donald Judd, Dan Flavin, Sala Witt, and Carl Andre, among others. What Martin referred to as, quote, greater perfection of form was evident in the industrial produced and hard-edged composition of these artists, who also presented their works in serial presentations. Despite characteristics that certainly distinguish her work from theirs, the minimalist as they became known, the more hard-edged approach and seriality were evident in the first group of paintings Martin completed after her break. So these are paintings from 1974. Having said all that, probably the most obvious difference in the new paintings, and something that was definitely remarked on at the time, was Martin's reintroduction of color, these soft pastel colors. In this case, red and blue, and later she would add yellow. So this was a big change for Martin from her gray paintings from the late 60s. And then she continued to use these primary colors on and off for the rest of her career. But it's to the serial aspect of her work that I want to draw attention. This series discussed now here includes 10 paintings in pink and blue bands that are sometimes horizontal and sometimes vertical. Each group of stripes is framed by a white border and divided in half by a thin white band. While each painting can stand alone, it helps to see more than one to understand the parameters of the systems. And it seems important that the process of observation takes time as one looks from one to the next. So I'm showing you Untitled number 20 from 1974. I should add too that the numbers and the titles for this series actually comes from the number of stripes they have. They weren't ordered 1, 2, 3, 4. They have this particular one has 20 stripes, and it's called Untitled number 20. So anyway, what I wanted to bring your attention to is that you can see that the edges of the stripes are clearly defined. And though not necessarily true, the paintings look labor intensive, less labor intensive than the tight drawn grids of the 1960s. The effort of making the paintings is perhaps not as evident, a factor that might allow us to see them as happier in Martin's terms. So you can see these aspects again in a complete series called The Islands from 1979. They are 12 related panels that make up a single work. This is perhaps Martin's most minimal work, in that the paintings are mostly white, and she used a systemic approach related to that of the younger artist. Though I have to point out, there's really no obvious system here. Her layout is intuitive, using similar elements. There's no system as you go from one to another. The canvases appear essentially white, but as one compares one to the next, stripes of different widths and very subtle color shifts become noticeable. It doesn't really translate into photographs, I have to say, because you have to kind of be in the room with all 12 canvases around you to really get the idea. The work takes time and contemplation, which I think is part of her purpose in making serial presentations. Her film Gabriel, made in 1976, not too much earlier, suggests that she was thinking about time passages at this point in her career. The film is about a young boy who walks from the ocean up a mountain in a journey through forest, along brooks, and among fields of flowers. More abstractly, Referring to her series of paintings, Martin spoke of the similarity but variety in her work, of looking at clouds and never seeing the same pattern twice, or similarly standing on the beach and watching the waves come in and go out. So the film is kind of a visualization of some of the ideas that she had. It's a passage through time, but the child watches the waves come and go, brooks passing, clouds passing, flowers waving in the fields. So I'm suggesting that that passage of time and time is an important aspect in these serial works. Another important aspect of the later paintings that is also characteristic of Martin's penciled grid paintings, and that is their elusive appearances, is in an often cited review written in 1971 about the penciled grid paintings, Kasia Lindbill described the way the viewer perceives these paintings. From afar, the works appear as a single tone of gray, but as one approaches the painting, the lines become more and more apparent, only to dissolve again as one moves away. It's most obvious in the paintings from the 1960s. You'll see that their surfaces are sort of hazy, and then it takes sustained looking and moving back and forth to realize their competitions. We like to think that the zoom feature in the catalogue raisonné sort of mimics this way of viewing the paintings. But because the paintings, you can't really see them from one spot, that's one of the reasons why they're so hard to photograph, because you really can't get the full picture of the experience from one distance. In later works, each individual painting often has a similar elusive quality. It's most evident in the paintings up till the 1980s, the mid 1980s. So in some, like the 1974 group, this is another one from the 74 group on the left. And again, in the paintings from 1980, which I'm showing you on the right, Untitled number 4, it's achieved by the way the color is applied. You really have to study these paintings to see the color. This isn't just bad photographs. They really are very sparsely colored. The white undercoating tends to absorb the colors, so the color sort of comes and goes. And in the 1980 painting, perception of the washes of red, yellow, and blue really takes sustained looking, kind of like the islands that I was describing just before. In the group from 1975, the color is subtle, but the challenging aspect of this group is that the compositions are not exactly symmetrical. The stripes vary in width. Again, you have to look closely to fully perceive this aspect of the composition. Similarly, in 1981, she made a group of paintings with thin bands of red, yellow, and blue, ribbons of color. It looks like the colors were put on in some kind of order, but it's not an obvious one if so. The group from 1977 are perhaps the most similar to the 1960s pencil grid, but are made with ink and wash. A reading of the flatness of the surface is blurred by the texture in the gesso undercoating that picks up the wash, and the ink lines making stripes or grids become evident with careful looking. And the 1984 series is similar, but with even rougher and more pronounced unevenness in the surface. This has very many parallel horizontal lines. It is this characteristic of Martin's painting, the here and not here aspect, that I think most fundamentally distinguishes it from the art of her younger colleagues, artists such as Judd Andre Lewitt or Robert Ryman, who she's often paired with. If their work depends on establishing a kind of presence, making the object fully present and available in the real space of the viewer, hers is less insistent on that. In fact, when asked why she would discard certain paintings, she would often say it was because they were too aggressive. It's the ambiguity, the here and there aspect that was important to her. To look back at some of her earlier work again, a nail painting, kind of like Homage to Greece from 1962, and The Laws, an 8-foot plank that leans against the wall from 1958. It's interesting to note that unlike Judd and Flavin, who were moving off the wall in 1962, from making paintings to creating more sculptural objects at the same time, Martin went the other direction. Instead of developing the material presence of the works, which was evident in the nail paintings and works such as The Laws, she went back to mark making, replacing the brads with dots and dabs of paint. So I'm showing you the islands again, 1961, and then a watercolor on the right called Summer. And I should point out that in these pairings, the size is very different. This is the painting is 6 by 6 feet, and the watercolor on the right is 8.5 inches by 8.5 inches. So sorry, like not really representing the scale correctly here. But then back to this point about the object nature of the paintings. This is a painting showing Martin in her studio in 1961, and it has a large oil painting and a large nail painting in the background. It's a work that no longer exists and presumably was destroyed after Martin changed course. It's in relation to this point too about the here and now that I would like to discuss Martin's frames. I've often been asked about the frames on Martin's painting, especially the metal frames on most of her post-1974 works. And I'm showing you an example here. It's a thin frame with a narrow gap between the edge of the canvas and the frame. Some people have questioned whether it was the artist's choice to put these frames on the work. She was certainly open to advice from people she trusted on the framing and installation of her work, but she certainly approved, as she had plenty of opportunity to suggest alternatives if she didn't like it. In addition, she always used frames, even thin wooden strip frames in her early paintings. I think the frame surprised people because her work is so often associated with the kind of painting done around the same time, Frank Stella's painting, for example, that assert their presence into real space and abandon the use of frames. Martin's frames, though quite slim and light, tend to set the paintings off from real space and set up a pictorial space. They are not easel paintings by any means, but exist in a space released to the imagination, somewhere between the perspectival space of conventional pictures with a window-like frame and large unframed mural type paintings that seem to exist in the viewer's immediate real space. Besides the actual frames, it's clear that Martin considered the framing of her compositions by the format of the works within the canvas. She often made borders around her grids and stripes. I'm showing you an example here. Falling Blue on the right, and again, the islands. And then another group, Field on the left from 1965, which has a penciled grid within it. And then in a 1974 painting, we can still see that she was using frames. It was still an address. She was continuing to work that way in that kind of format. Still in 1983, 1984, she was framing the compositions. But then in 1988, she tends to play it both ways, with lines extending to the edge and others that don't. So I'm showing you Untitled number 15 from 1988. And on the left is a detail of that painting to try to show you the edge. Like many, this is one of those paintings where the stripes look like they might extend all the way out, but if you look closely, you can see that the graphite lines end before the edge. The art critic, Peter Sheldall, mentioned this characteristic in his description of the islands, suggesting that once you notice the lines don't go to the edges, quote, the fields of paint jiggle loose and hover. In a statement which might help in understanding Martin's position on what I've been thinking of as objectness, but she refers to as the concrete. She said, quote, "Violence, destructiveness, and possessiveness are an integral part of response to the concrete. The transcendent response that is free from and unrelated to the concrete environment is so blissful and seems so much more innocent. Its abstract response, the response that we make with our mind free from the concrete." There are obviously many other elements besides the nature of the edge that Martin was considering in the various series she made. Comparing these two paintings, Untitled number 1 from 1988 and Untitled number 9 from 1990, you can see that she was working with proportion, how you divide the canvas with wide and narrow stripes to make different visual rhythms. And in some paintings, I'm thinking of the islands in comparison to this one I'm showing you here, Untitled number 3 from 1989. She seems to have been dealing with transparency and opacity. So if the islands, the group of the islands are the kind of white paintings that you can kind of see through the surface, these paintings, which we call the black paintings, are really opaque, and the surface is very flat and you can't really visually enter it. After she reduced the size of her paintings in 1993, the serial aspect of her work became less obvious. She continued to present works in series, but the relationships of the paintings within these groups became less rigid. By 2000, the paintings appear quite independent of each other, though obviously related to her larger body of work. I'm showing here a screenshot of paintings from 2001 as an example. And then by 2003, a year before she died, quite surprisingly, after more than 40 years of painting stripes, geometric forms started to appear in her paintings. Some of these last works appeared to have more in common with early works than those from the intervening years. So I'm here. Oh yeah, I forgot to. So these are the last works. Showing homage to life on the left and Untitled number 1 on the right. So these works were a radical shift for her at the end of her life, and they really do recall some of her earlier paintings. And I'm showing you these two drawings from 1960 and 1961 that are probably the most obvious related works. It's been suggested that in some sense, she was trying to round out her oeuvre by addressing the loose ends from her earlier work in these last works. Given the title of the painting on the left, again, it's called Homage to Life, perhaps we can see that these last works were an embrace of the totality of her oeuvre in her final year. So that's it. Thank you so much. And I will be ready for questions. Let's see.
Here, hi.
Hi.
That was wonderful. What a wonderful overview. As you say, it seems completely impossible to address a painter like this in photographic form. And experiencing the works is absolutely necessary to get the sense of transcendence that you described so well. There's a bunch of questions that were posed during your lecture, so I'll read out a couple of them.
Okay.
For you. You mentioned the film Gabriel, and you did describe it a bit, but Ileana Ortega asked, where could we see the film? Is it available online?
I don't think it is available online. The Museum of Modern Art has a copy, and I think the Whitney has a copy, and there are screenings of it every once in a while. We have, a small segment of it is available on the catalogue raisonné.
How long is it? Is it a long film?
It's a full film. It's a full, hour and a half, I'd say, film. And it's kind of slow, but it's quite beautifully filmed.
And in black and white, just curious.
It's in color and black and white. It's in color and it has a bit of music to it. It's in color. Yeah.
So does it seem odd to you that she would have entered into film? I mean, after being so dedicated to this two-dimensional medium, not that film is not two-dimensional, it has the illusion of not being two-dimensional. But do you see a continuity, I mean, other than what you described in terms of this sort of slow discovery of experience
Yeah.
sensation?
Yeah. Um, I think she was experimental. I think that some of the obvious thing. And she talked about making a film because she didn't like the films that she was seeing in the movie theaters because she thought they were too violent and they were too aggressive in her terms. So I think she decided to make a film because she thought she could do anything. It is not it it's a lovely gesture, I think, but the filming she uses a handheld camera, so sometimes the kind of jitters a little bit, and there are different things, and it's kind of a slow film. And she then tried to do another film, but apparently a couple of years later, which was another. It was apparently about a story about Genghis Khan, and it's a very weird idea, but she worked on it for quite a long time, but then ultimately decided that it didn't measure up, and she destroyed it. So we don't know
It
what
would
it
be
was. Although
fascinating
we
to know what that really was about, because that's a very strange departure, it would seem.
it would
Genghis Khan.
it would seem so. Again, it was about a passage. It was about going from one place to another, and was just basically based on the film. There's a text that describes it a bit, because she was accompanied by a friend who was helping her to film it at the time. So
Oh,
there's a bit known about it.
great. And then from John Dumbacher, who says, your extensive research is wonderful. Did you have a sense while working on this project how Agnes would have felt about the catalogue raisonné, about the compilation that you've done? And did you have an opportunity to meet her?
Um, I did meet her, but not in the context of doing the catalogue raisonné. So just I saw her at an opening at the Dia Art Center when the Dia Art Foundation, when she opened her works there, and it was already 2003, and I certainly didn't get a chance to speak to her, nor did I know I was going to be working on a catalogue raisonné. I think she would have been happy. She was a very private person, so it took quite an effort to get her friends and artist friends and other people to work with me a little bit, but I was able to get the help of quite a few friends. Richard Tuttle was a very close friend of hers, and he was very helpful, and a number of other collectors and people who knew her were very helpful. So I think the feeling I got from them is that she would have approved. So ultimately she would have approved because she cared a lot about her work. So she wanted the work to be disseminated and people to get it. So I think probably she would have liked the fact that the catalogue raisonné went into the research of the catalogue raisonné went into the retrospective exhibition. I think she would have been happy about the exhibition.
I mean, it's an interesting question in that, of course, there's certain artists who become very well aware of the whole activity of the catalogue raisonné and become somewhat obsessed with it. And, Picasso was a great example. And I remember Jeffrey Weiss speculating about whether or not he was actively speaking to the catalogue raisonné and looking at it actively and trying to respond to it and correct his own work and his own production, which I thought was a really interesting and egotistical version of an artist too aware almost of their legacy. But it doesn't surprise me that Agnes Martin wouldn't be like that, because she just strikes me. There's a certain type of, you say that she was very confident and very sure of herself, but there's such a quietness too. I mean, obviously an assertiveness in that she's so obsessively consistent in her interests, in terms of picture making. And weirdly, they are pictures, even though they're such pure abstractions, they remain pictures, which is a very odd quality I've always found. But anyway, I'm just babbling now. Let me get to the next question. Here's someone called Mark Suma who says, I saw the Agnes Martin retrospective at LACMA a few years ago and was struck by the deeply spiritual atmosphere her work transmits, especially the work she did in her last years. The experience of viewing her work was similar to sitting in the Rothko Chapel in Houston or in the small room of Rothko paintings at the Phillips. And this is really just a comment rather than a question, but would you kind of agree with that notion of the sublime?
I like that someone felt that way. And Rocco was one of her very favorite artists. She probably mentioned him as much as any other artist. And she actually created a permanent installation of her work in a museum at the Harwood Museum in Taos. And I think it was a reflection of the Rothko Chapel to some extent. So I think that had a big influence on her. And getting back to the question about catalogue raisonnés and whether she would have been involved with it, I would say she did not make it easy to make a catalogue raisonné about herself because she kept no records at all. I mean, none. So no correspondence, no books, catalogs, or anything, no photographs, nothing. She kept nothing because she lived a very sparse existence. So, she traveled quite a bit, or she moved around quite a bit, and she sort of just would pick up and leave from one studio and go to another. So there was really very little that was available from her own. There was no archive, but luckily because the Pace Gallery had handled her work from 1974 all the way to the end of her life, they had a fairly good record of all the things she had done. So that was what made that easier. But anyway, that was just to go back on that question a bit.
And then from Joan Davidson, she used ruler in early grid works. Did she use tape later to get thin white lines, or did she still stick with the ruler?
She used rulers, but she also did use tape, yes. We have some photographs that show tape hanging off some of her paintings. And you can see if you look at some of the edges, I would say it would be in the post-1974 works that you would see taped edges occasionally. And
then here from an anonymous attendee, if you could curate a show with Martin's work, comparing and contrasting it with the work by another artist, which artists would you choose? I'm thinking of the recent show in New York showing Albers and Morandi together, for example.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a good question. I haven't given that a lot of thought. I know so much more about Agnes Martin that it would be hard for me to bring up another artist in the same way. But I will answer it in a negative way. I think that I was misled by some of the pairings that are usually done. So pairing her work with Robert Ryman, for example, I don't think works well at all, or any of the more minimal artists. And I tried to make that distinction in the talk. So I would look, I would look, let's see, I'd have to give some thought to that. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you.
No, I think that is a good answer, actually, right? The duographic approach, it depends whether or not it's revelatory or not. And sometimes, as you say, it's actually quite misleading. It did make me think a little bit about gendering, though, and I wondered whether or not you think of her work, or she thought of her work, in terms of a gendered or ungendered version of things, especially vis-a-vis the minimalist, so-called.
Yeah. She thought of her work as ungendered. I mean, she didn't want to be known as a woman artist, but you would probably guess that from her position. And but she had interesting thoughts for women artists and or for women and artists generally. And I think there's a lot to be said, but her personal life, she was lesbian, so there was a lot. She was very private about her whole life because of the mental illness she had, and because she was lesbian. So she really didn't want people to know that much about her. So there is a kind of mask, and it's been suggested by that the grids are kind of a mask of privacy, so that she kind of hides behind. I don't know if I would necessarily agree with that, but I think for sure she did not want to express herself in her work, her personal self at all. Now, whether it is or not expressed, that's another question. But
from Annie Alberth, did Agnes Martin have any close friends or relationships spanning across her career?
She had a number of close relationships, and they would probably have spanned. She didn't have any partners that she kept for very long. It's not exactly clear to me who her partners were. Again, that has been held privately, but she had a number. Well, Ellsworth Kelly, she was very friendly with. They were in shared a studio building in Coenty Slip in the late 50s. And there was a few years there where Kelly said he had, Agnes Martin said that Kelly had breakfast with him every morning because she could cook on a stove, a pot-bellied stove. She could make biscuits. And so Kelly would come for breakfast apparently. But I think that it's a relationship. I mean, Kelly would go to her shows later on and vice versa, but I don't think they didn't stay in close contact. She had a number of friends that would, younger friends often, that would be very helpful to her and be sort of like assistants for some periods of time. But she was very independent and tried to stay that way. That was important to her. I think it also had to do with her illness. I mean, I think it was very difficult for her to maintain long-term personal relationships. So she found it was easier to deal with her illness alone, I think.
And then from Bob Marshall, what mechanical aids did Martin use to make her grids?
Rulers and tape, I guess, is really what she used. There's only one painting I know of that may have been scored with a mechanical tool. But for the most part, they are drawn using rulers, and she used short rulers because she would, and I think that's where the tape would be helpful, so that she would mark the tape with guides for the ruler and then move the ruler across, and you can sometimes see sort of a gentle jog where the lines connect. And I think, again, that was to stress the handmade aspect of the work. That was important to her, that she would actually make them, that you could see that they had little, maybe say mistakes, but they weren't mistakes. You can see that in the drawings more often, that the ruler slipped and she lets it go. It's just there.
Are there any films of her working? Did she allow herself to be filmed?
She did. There are some films. There's a beautiful film by Mary Lance that shows her working. And again, we've put clips of the various films on the catalog raisonné. There's a video section, so you can see those. Oh yeah, Mary's film is called With My Back to the World. And it includes some very beautiful interviews with Agnes Martin. It was made later in her life. Earlier, she didn't really want to have people in her studio, but later on, she allowed people to see her paint. And there are some sections where she's painting in the studio.
Because I would almost assume that the implication of the short ruler, I mean, it has sort of interesting connotations just based on childhood association. But also it does mean that you're very proximate to the canvas surface, and you always get the feeling looking at her works that she needs to make them as if in them almost. She's so close to the surface. You know how some artists, you get a sense that they're constantly backing away and then judging the effect and then moving back in. You almost get the sense that she never backs away until it's finished. If you, I don't know if that's even true, but that's just the sensation that you have.
Well, I do know that she had to paint her, in the film that shows her painting, she is close to the canvas and she's painting quite rapidly because she was painting these paintings in New Mexico where the climate is very dry. And she was using acrylic, very thinned out acrylic paint that would dry quite fast. So she actually had to paint the paintings quite fast in order to get the surfaces to be the same, for the stripes to look the same from one stripe to the next, so it wouldn't dry, so that she would have to go over it. And I think it was, there's a funny remark she makes in the film where she's, painting and she turns to the camera and she says, "You think this is easy, but it's not, it's very hard."
So true painting. And then from Charles Wiley, Charlie asks, did Martin leave instructions for how her works were to be installed in both private homes and museum settings? This is a great question.
Yeah. She did not, except through the Pace Gallery. She didn't really leave any instructions about the installation of her works or about the framing or any other aspect of it. However, she had a close relationship with Arnie Glimcher that spanned for 40 years or more. And he is sort of her spokesperson and has, made some suggestions, but there are no major considerations compared to, say, an artist like Flavin, who was the other artist that I worked on for a long time, where there are a lot of specifications on how the work should be installed. But she didn't even say if she wanted them high or low. The one thing she did say is she did, again, with a reference to Rothko, she liked the lighting to be sort of dim with her work. Mm-hmm. She preferred that. So that was the only thing that I can think of that she specified.
And then just a couple more. I don't want to keep you for too much longer. You did get a lot of questions, though. Where are the murals that Ms. Martin made for the AT&T building in New York City for Philip Johnson? I think there were 3 and they were terrific.
The murals that Martin made for the AT&T building. I'm not familiar with that.
Not ringing any bells.
No.
Okay, well, sorry about that. We're going to have to skip that one.
Yeah.
Did you come across any affinity that Martin had with Zen? If so,
absolutely.
How do you see this influencing her work and or her philosophy?
Oh, yes. She was definitely very influenced by Asian philosophy and was a great meditator. And she, when she was at Columbia, she went to lectures that were given by a famous philosopher whose name I'm forgetting right now. But she was very well versed in that as well. At the same time that Cage and so on was also involved, and she was really in New York during that time and where it was very prevalent, and she kept up with that for a long time. So I think that was extremely important to her. There's an essay actually in the catalogue of the exhibition that describes her relationships with the Zen and Oriental, the Eastern philosophies.
And then here's the last question from someone that you know, Hannah Barton.
Oh, I do?
Yeah. And who also works at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art and is our archivist. She says, "Hi, Tiffany, great presentation. Did Agnes Martin keep any of her own work in her home? And do you know if she had any attachments to specific works?"
That's a great question. And I should thank Hannah. Hannah was one of the researchers on the Agnes Martin project. So she was a great help. She did not keep any of her works. She said that her favorite moment was when they went out the door. um, is what she said. And she, I don't think she had any attachments to particular works, although, so she didn't, there were no, she did keep a stack of drawings that she traveled with quite a bit, that came with her from one studio to the next. But besides that, I don't think she kept too much. She didn't even keep her catalog. She didn't keep really anything. And she did have a Georgia O'Keeffe poster in her living space at one point.
Of which work?
I think it was a 1917 work, a very abstract kind of a wall. Do you know those works of Georgia O'Keeffe that from that very early period where they're sort of her most abstract works? But she did know Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe was some sort of a role model for her, who lived in New Mexico, a woman artist, very independent. And she'd looked Georgia O'Keeffe up in the 40s, I think, when she was first out in New Mexico, when she was teaching and going to school out there. And there's some small stories about how she met Georgia O'Keeffe and found her exhausting because she had so much energy, but things like that.
Right.
But I don't think she kept too many keepsakes, Heather. Hannah, she said that she, the things she valued were a good car, because she liked to travel, and a warm coat. Those are the things that she kept with her always.
Well, that's pretty minimalist. So, did she give her work away frequently to friends? And
she did not give her work away to friends so much, mainly because her dealers would
have a cat.
Yeah, would not like that so much. And I'm grateful to say that she didn't give too many away, but she did give some away. But she was extremely generous. She gave away works to museums, her own works, and she also bought other artists' works and gave them to museums. And she was also extremely generous in the town of Taos, donating anonymously for parks and parks and swimming pools and all kinds of things. And I can say too that her first, she had her first, one of the things I found in the research was she'd stopped painting in 1967. She started again in 1973. She had her first exhibition at her first retrospective exhibition at the Institute of Arts in Philadelphia, part of the University of Pennsylvania. And then she had her first exhibition at Pace in 1974, and she donated half the proceeds of the exhibition, or more, I think almost the full proceeds of the exhibition at Pace to the University of Pennsylvania, to the ICA.
Nice.
And again, anonymously. She, when the ICA was a young institution at that time, so it could really use the money.
I mean, I'm assuming that she married an extremely wealthy person. Is that true?
Yes, she was. But she gave, as I say, she gave a lot away. So she didn't really have a huge estate, I don't think, at the end, because she had given much of her wealth away, and she lived very minimally.
God, that seems sort of ironic almost, because she does seem like such a spare individual in terms of the way that she lived. It's just odd that the art world is such that she ended up being probably one of the wealthiest artists of her generation. It's just a weird phenomenon of our experience in the contemporary art world, I guess. But yeah, it's just one of those things. I'm sure money was not ever an overriding motivation for her. It doesn't seem like she was materialistic in the least. So
no, she did have, as I said, she liked to have a good car. So she had a white Mercedes at the end of her life that she drove around.
Well, there's that at least.
Most ostentatious possession she had.
Of course, it was white too. So, well, I think we probably should come to a conclusion here. But thank you so much. It was a fascinating lecture, and I hope that people take advantage of the website for the catalog raisonné, the digital catalog raisonné, and discover all these wonderful resources that you've provided. And I hope they also go out and find your exhibition catalog, because I know that that was really a very much admired publication. The show made an enormous impression on everyone who saw it. So congratulations on that. And congratulations on Bryce Martin, another artist who is incredibly obsessive and repetitive too. So you seem to have really carved out a niche for yourself.
I guess it takes a certain personality. What can I say?
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us. I hope you come back and join us again soon. We'll let you know online when the next Art Matters lecture will take place. All right. Thank you.
Bye.